Guess what? In the middle of your giant HD TV. Most of the time when I make kids today jokes, I'm joking. This one I'm not. Everybody does it too. She's a kid today. Don't feel too bad.
Do you have anyone that ever resist that? I've found the Horizon camera, you can still shoot in portrait, but it
also does like a giant full frame thing. Yep. You could also shoot on super 35 millimeter if you want to do that.
All right, so there's going to be like 2 minutes of Davey ranting about. No, I was recording. Assuming this works, there's going to be a lot of Davey ranting about portrait versus landscape video recording. So yeah, let's talk about React. Can I have a volunteer? Sorry, do you want to read out loud for the class? What is React?
A declarative, efficient, and flexible JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It encourages the creation of reusable UI components which present data that changes.
Thank you. That was lovely. See, and this is nice with the camera because you can like focus on her. Yeah. Yeah, so this is kind of a amalgam definition. It was pretty hard to find a 1 or 2 line definition of React, so this is from a couple different of Facebook's React documentation, as well as a couple blog posts that I found particularly helpful. But so as you know, a lot of modern websites do a lot of things, not just static pages. You know, like back in the day, it was just a bunch of pages and pretty much you linked from one to the other, and that's about all you could do. They do a lot of things now. Just think about Facebook. You've got things constantly updating, people messaging you, liking things, posting things, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of changes to the UI that need to be re-rendered often, and those changes need to be reflected. So React is a framework that lets you do that easily. So let's talk a little bit about what these different words mean. So you notice I have nicely italicized some of them. So let's talk about declarative first. Does anyone have any idea what declarative means? Yeah.
Requires all variables to be declared beforehand.
That is a version of declared that's not declarative in the sense that we're talking about here. But good answer. So really what we're talking about is declarative versus imperative. So imperative is like describing how to do something. Declarative is more about describing what you want to do. And that will probably make more sense with some examples. So for instance, example number 1, arriving at a restaurant. Why are we talking about restaurants? Because this is programming. But what is your favorite restaurant where you sit down, Tom? McDonald's? You don't have servers at McDonald's. I need a place with servers. What was it? BJ's Brewhouse. Would you like to pretend to be the host at BJ's Brewhouse? Excellent. All you really have to do is say, welcome to BJ's Brewhouse. Can you do that for me? All right, so pretend I just walked in. Hi, I'm here with my friend Dave. So we'll need a table for 2. Probably that table over in the corner is great. If you could clean the stuff off of there before you take us over there, that'd be awesome. And then we'll go over there and sit down. If you could bring us 2 menus, probably 2 sets of silverware, a water for both of us.
Napkins, I'm really sloppy.
Davey's really sloppy. He would like some napkins. And then we'll look on the menus, decide what we want to eat. We'll tell you that. And then if you could take that order to the kitchen so they can make that food for us and then bring it out. And then we're going to eat it. And then if you bring us, you know, something that tells us how much to pay you, we'll do that. And then if you did a good job, I'll give you a tip. Good? Right? So, based on the definitions, do you think that's more imperative or declarative? Was I just giving you a general overview of what I want to happen, or was I telling you specifically how to do things? That was an overview? That was not an overview. That was very step-by-step, me telling you exactly what needed to happen, right? So that's an example of imperative. Now we're going to do the declarative version. So welcome me to the restaurant again. Hey, man, I'd like a table for 2. The end. So I'm just saying what I want to have happen, right? And I assume all the nitty-gritty details are going to get taken care of because you know what you're doing. Make sense? Here's another example, driving a car. Anybody in here know how to drive a manual transmission? Just a couple? Yeah, there's not a lot in either class. I learned on that, and I can tell you it is a bit more complicated than an automatic transmission, especially when you're first learning how to drive. But so let's talk about that. So if I am driving manual transmission, think about all the steps that need to go into that. Step 1, push in the clutch before you even start the car. Push in the clutch, start the car, give it some gas. Then when I decide I want to go, it is put it into first gear, slowly start letting off the clutch as I give it a little gas, and then as we fully engage the gear, and then when the RPMs get up to about 3,500, then I'm going to engage the clutch again, let off the gas, go into second gear, let off the clutch, give it a little more gas. A little complicated. That's like the imperative version of driving a car, compared to the automatic version, which is I turn the key, I put it in drive, and then I push the pedal, right? It's a bit easier. Does that kind of make sense, the difference between declarative and imperative? So let's look at some code examples. Take a minute to look at this, and then after you have pondered, let me know if you think this is declarative or imperative code. Anybody have any thoughts? And why do you say imperative, Pranav?
Because you're assuming that the computer doesn't know how to automatically multiply, so you're literally telling it how to multiply.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of things very step by step. So if we just read through here, we start out in the function. Like, hey, I'm going to initialize a variable that I'm calling multiplied array. I'm going to set that to an empty array. And then I'm going to do a loop. I'm going to initialize another counter variable. I'm going to do this for as long as we're less than the original array length. And we're going to increment that every time. Then I'm going to make another variable, which we're going to set equal to whatever values at the original index multiplied by 3. And then I'm going to push that value onto the array. And then finally, I'm going to turn the array. Compared to the declarative version, same function, same output. I'm basically just saying, hey, just take this array and multiply everything by 3 and give me that. Right? So you'll find this is very similar as we get into React. So a lot of the things you've done in normal JavaScript, where we are creating an element, changing the text content, adding to the class list, putting the thing on the page, you know, all those different steps, a very imperative way to go about it, perfectly fine way to do it. But React just lets us say, hey, just put some stuff on the page. That would be great. All right, back to our definition. So that was declarative. Let's talk a little bit about the efficiency part. So why is React efficient? The main thing is DOM manipulation and rendering is slow. So the stuff that takes place in your JavaScript is pretty quick, but when you actually have to start then taking your JavaScript to change things in the actual DOM, that part is relatively slow. So what React does, it represents your entire user interface as JavaScript objects. And so it knows exactly how everything looks as a JavaScript object. And that way, when things change, it can compare what the current state of things are and what the updated state is, and then only re-render the parts that have changed. So as opposed to just arbitrarily doing things whether they've changed or not, it can do this comparison in pure JavaScript, comparing those two different JavaScript objects, and only change what's necessary. So it's a bit more efficient way of rendering the UI. So the process of determining what has changed is called diffing, and then actually changing those things is called reconciliation. So how do we actually make a React app? 4 things you need. Number 1, an HTML page with at least one empty element. Usually just a div. So your actual HTML page is super simple. It's just basically that HTML5 boilerplate that we do. And then just add a single div on the page is enough for a React app. Second thing we need, pretty obvious, we need the React library. So whether we get that through Node Package Manager or get it through a CDN, just like we imported Foundation a couple different ways, we need a reference to React so we can use it. need one or more React components. So you need to create those. And then the last but not least, you'll usually only have one of these per app. Just basically a call in your JavaScript to attach your component to that empty element that's on the page. So it's basically saying, hey, React, grab this element, and that's where we're going to render our whole app. So those are the 4 things you need. So I know we've said React components a few times, but what actually are those? So let's think about some pretty typical HTML. So this is a header for my website. It's clearly the best website because it tells you right in the H1. And we made it customized so it welcomes you by name specifically. And then we just have 4 nav links that go to different pages, right? So pretty standard. Probably something that might appear on every page on our website, you know, the same header for all of them. So meaning, if I were to do this in the traditional way, I would need to like copy and paste this code into every single page, right? Because we'd have to redo that same markup. But what if we could just make our own HTML tag that we called app header? We could just pass it the name we want it to render as an attribute, so that way we can change it whenever we want. And by just putting in this element, it knew how to render all that other stuff. So that's basically what we're doing with React. So this is how that would look as a React component. So start out by just declaring your class. And the name of the class is just whatever you want that component to be called. And that extends React component. Does anybody know what extends means? Have you used the language where you use extends? Yeah? What is it? Yeah, basically. So it's like inheritance, right? A class can inherit from another class. So you get all the functionality of that class, and then you can extend it further. So basically this is saying React has a class called component, and we're going to extend that with our class. So we get all the React functionality as we're writing our component. Now the only method that is required for a React component is the render method, because that's what's going to return what we actually put on the page. You can have a lot of different methods in there, and we'll see some examples in some further slides, but that's the one method you have to have. And then other than that, it looks basically like HTML, right? So pretty easy. Now you notice, if you look at this, there are 2 differences between what's in the return statement there and normal HTML. One's pretty obvious and one is a little more subtle. Can you tell me what a difference might be compared to normal HTML? And Jules, you can't answer. I know you already know. What's some things you would not normally see in regular HTML? Yeah. Yeah, so we got those weird curly braces in the H2, and then we're calling this .props.name. So yeah, in JavaScript components, or in React components, the curly braces is basically saying, hey, inside these curly braces, this is just going to be a JavaScript expression. So it could be a variable name, it could be an actual function, it could be whatever. It's just normal JavaScript inside those. So that's how, in the particular case we were talking about, that's how it would access that name property that we passed in. Everything you pass in what looks like an attribute is called props. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we have access to it inside. And there's one other difference on the line right below that one. Anybody see what it is? A little bit different than normal HTML. Yeah, so class name instead of class. You may think of why we would need to do that. Why couldn't we just call it class? Yeah. Right. So when we were in just an HTML file, class just means an attribute on an HTML element, right? But now we're in using JavaScript, and class means something to JavaScript. It's a reserved keyword, right? Because we're actually making our React component by using the class keyword. So we can't use class inside anything else unless we actually want to start another class. So Just need to make sure to use class name. And there's a few other examples of those as well, but this is the biggest one you'll run into by far. If you want to add a class to what eventually gets rendered as your UI, just make sure you use class name. So, looks a lot like HTML, but as we've just established, it is not actually HTML. This is what's called JSX, which is short for JavaScript XML. So when they were making React, you can do it without JSX. It doesn't look super pretty. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But this was a way they came up with so that you could just basically write things that look like HTML, but can also execute JavaScript stuff. So if we don't use JSX, that is what it actually looks like. So under the hood, when you do that, it's actually a bunch of nested calls to React create element. The first argument is just what type of element you're making. Next argument is any properties you want to pass, and then after that is the children for that. So you can see we make the header. Child of that is the H1 and the H2. Not a super fun way to program them. So you can do that if you want. If you want to do that, feel free. But I would recommend just using JSX. But just understand, it's not actual HTML. It's just cover over JavaScript that lets it look like HTML. All right. So we mentioned props a little bit. Let's go ahead. Jackie, you want to read this slide for me?
Conceptually, a React component can be thought of as a JavaScript function. It can accept arbitrary inputs called props and return React elements, describing what should appear on the screen.
Yes. So just think of your components kind of like functions. So calling the function, you call the function by putting the tag for it on the page, right? And then if you need to pass any additional arguments to it, you just do them in that way. So like we said, name equals Steve. So it was like, looks like an HTML attribute, but that's actually passing those into the created component. So you can think of it as like, we call the function by putting the tag on the page, and then the additional parameters we need to provide to it are passed through the props. So because they are basically like arguments, they can be pretty much anything that normal JavaScript arguments could be. Could be strings, objects, arrays, other functions, booleans, pretty much anything. So here's some examples. So we've got the class myComponent, and you can see in our render method, it's just a button and then 2 paragraphs. What do you think happens? Oh, and then at the bottom, here's how we're actually putting it on the page. So we're putting a tag for myComponent on the page, and then passing in these 3 different props. So when I click that button, what do you think is going to happen? So I've got an onClick handler on the button, right? And that's going to call what function? Alert me, right? So I passed in, we declared that function at the very top there. We passed it into our component as alert me. And so when we click that, it has a prop called alert me, because that's what we called it here. And it's just going to call that function. We know that function is going to put an alert on the page. Make sense? And then what do you think it's going to say on the next line? My name is... It's not Steve. What is it? Emilio. And what do you think Emilio's favorite Boolean is? True. Everybody needs a favorite Boolean. All right. So props are received from outside the component, and they cannot be changed from inside the component, otherwise known as immutable. So think back to some of the things we've made over the last few days. Were there ever times where we needed to keep track of things and change them? Right? So we had like the flicks array, like we needed to be able to add flicks to that, right? So props wouldn't really work for that for us in that case, because we could receive a list of, or an array of objects, but we couldn't change anything on them. if we pass them in as props. So that is where you get into state. So the two main concepts of React components are the props, which get passed in, but they're immutable, and then state, which is where if we need to keep track of our own data and also be able to modify that data, we use state. It's initialized in the constructor for the class, and then if we need to change state, use the setState method to do that. So let's take a look at this component, which I called clicky counter. And basically, there's just two things to it. A button that when we click it, it updates the count, and then a paragraph below it that just says how many times we've clicked the button. So you can look in the constructor up top there. So when we get a new instance of clicky counter by putting that tag on the page, it's going to initially run the constructor and set state to an object with a property of count that's set to 0, right? And then we have an additional method in this one called update count. And all that does is call set state and give a new object for state where count is equal to the previous count plus 1. So it's just going to add 1 every time we do that, right? So then when I do the click on the button, it's going to call this .update count. Update count is going to run set state, and then it's going to set our state to the count property to be 1 more than it was previously. Make sense? Excellent. Last step. So we got some components. We need to actually attach that to the DOM, the web page. So if we have, these would be in different files, probably. I mean, you could do it all in the same file. You just would need script tags to do that. But so the top part, the HTML, would be just in like an index HTML file. Super simple. Just got a head with a title in it, and then the body is just an empty div. We've got a basic React component that just says React app. And then this is what actually connects those two together. So you'll generally have just one React DOM.render call per React application. And it just takes 2 arguments. The first one is just the component that you want to render, and then where you want to render it. So you're familiar with document query selector. I think quite a few of you have also used getElementById. It's just a way to get a reference to that empty div. And it's just saying, hey, find that empty div, and then render my app component there. So that's how they actually get stuck together. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
So basically, whenever you're making a project on React, you need to follow that step. So whether it be attaching it to the DOM as well as props and state.
Mm-hmm. So not all components require state, not all components require props. You can do some, and we'll do some for the homework tonight, that are just pure, rendered just pure HTML. But those are all the things that you can do with it. And the good news is they actually created, so it used to take a lot of work to set up even a basic React app, because you had to have all your Babel transpilers and everything to be able to understand JSX. So you had to do like a Webpack config and all sorts of setup, do all the React DOM.render stuff yourself, like all that sort of stuff. The good news is they made a program called Create React App. So basically, and you guys installed that as part of the pre-work, or at least you should have if you followed the directions. So now you can just say from your command line in the terminal, create React app, and then the name of the app, and it'll do a lot of this initial setup for you. So you don't have to do a Webpack config. It'll do your initial call to React DOM.render. But it's important to understand what's going on, and we'll go over that many times. Certainly if you do it without Create React app, you're going to need to know all those steps, but a lot of that is taken care of for you at this point. Good question. All right. I think we're good on that.